America's first state fairs weren't just about prize-winning livestock, quilts, and marching bands. They were also a stage for food, wild, wonderful, and sometimes downright strange. From vinegar pies and molasses pulls to boiled ox tongue and even oyster ice cream, these fairs captured the heart of rural creativity and the spirit of a nation learning to celebrate itself. Today, we're taking a step back into the dust of the fairgrounds, where farmers' wives carried their best recipes, judges measured out spoonfuls with pride, and daring experiments in the kitchen found their audience for the first time. Some dishes became timeless classics. Others faded into obscurity, too odd, too heavy, or simply too tied to their era. This is the story of 25 wild recipes from America's first state fairs, dishes that shaped our tables, stirred our imaginations, and remind us of the quirky, resourceful heart of a young nation. Imagine biting into a watermelon, but instead of sweet fruit, you taste tangy vinegar and spice. That's what greeted many fairgoers in the 1800s. At America's earliest state fairs, nothing went to waste. Farmers and homemakers were experts at stretching ingredients. Pickled watermelon rinds, soaked in vinegar, sugar, and cloves, became a surprising showcase dish. It was thrifty, practical, and oddly refreshing. Judges loved it because it showed skill, turning scraps into delicacies. For farm families, it was a reminder of resourcefulness. At a time when refrigeration was rare, preserving food this way was also necessary for survival. But for children tasting it for the first time, the shock was unforgettable. The rind that once promised juicy sweetness delivered sour sharpness instead, an early memory of fairground food surprises. And just as watermelon rinds proved that scraps could shine, the next recipe showed how sweetness could be stretched into something shared by all: vinegar pie. On early fairgrounds, a sandwich wasn't just lunch, it could be a statement of pride. And few things turned heads like a thick slice of beef tongue between bread. In 19th century America, beef tongue wasn't unusual, it was a delicacy. Immigrant traditions, especially from Europe, celebrated it as tender, flavorful meat. At state fairs, farmers often showcased their best cuts, and tongue made an appearance not just on judging tables but in sandwiches for visitors. It demonstrated thrift and skill. A single cow could provide multiple meals, and nothing went to waste. Serving tongue in sandwiches also highlighted the cook's ability to prepare something tough into something tender. To many, it was proof of culinary craftsmanship. But for children and city visitors, the sight of a whole tongue being carved was unsettling. Some recalled turning away in disgust, while others were surprised at how rich and savory the first bite could be. And if beef tongue seemed bold, the next dish pushed resourcefulness even further: squirrel stew. At the early American state fairs, few dishes represented resourcefulness quite like squirrel stew. It might sound shocking today, but back then, it was a symbol of practicality, creativity, and survival. In rural communities, squirrels were abundant and free for the taking. Families often turned them into hearty stews, slow-cooked with onions, potatoes, and seasonal vegetables. What city visitors found strange, farm families considered a proud display of thrift. At a time when every scrap of food mattered, nothing went to waste, and squirrel meat was considered lean, tender, and full of flavor. For many, it wasn't just about taste. Squirrel stew showcased the self-sufficiency of frontier life, where families relied on hunting as much as farming. But to outsiders, especially wealthier fairgoers, the idea of eating a woodland critter felt unsettling, almost primitive. Yet that was the beauty of the fair, a place where rustic traditions sat side by side with refined recipes. And from stews, the attention soon turned to sweets, like the sticky, messy fun of a molasses taffy pull. Sticky, sweet, and full of laughter, few fair traditions were as memorable as the molasses taffy pull. At first glance, it wasn't just about the candy, it was about the gathering. In the 19th century, fairs were more than competitions for livestock or pies, they were social hubs. Families and neighbors would gather around steaming kettles of molasses, stretching and pulling the hot syrup until it cooled into shiny ropes of chewy taffy. Young people especially loved it, because it meant hours of mingling, sticky fingers, and plenty of excuses to laugh together. The fun masked the practicality. Molasses was cheap, abundant, and easy to turn into a treat that could feed a crowd. Yet, it carried a danger too. The syrup was boiling hot, and burns were common if patience ran thin. But despite the risks, the tradition lingered on as a symbol of togetherness. Messy, noisy, and unforgettable, before we move to another fairground curiosity, pickled pig's feet. At the dusty fairgrounds of the late 1800s, one dish always seemed to spark both fascination and hesitation: pickled pig's feet. Vendors proudly displayed glass jars filled with pale, tangy cuts, glistening in brine under the hot summer sun. To modern eyes, it may seem unthinkable, but back then, nothing went to waste. Preserving meat was essential for farm families, and pickling pig parts was not only thrifty but also considered a delicacy. At fairs, this dish was a showpiece of resourcefulness and tradition. Contest judges admired the clarity of the brine, the tenderness of the meat, and the strong tang that hinted at old-world recipes. For some, it was a daring taste, chewy, sour, and bold. Children might wrinkle their noses while older folks praised its strength and heartiness. It was both a curiosity and a comfort, a food that carried whispers of the immigrant kitchens that helped shape America's earliest fairs. And so, even as sweet treats and delicate pies filled the tables, jars of pickled pig's feet stood proudly, reminding everyone of the grit, thrift, and flavor that defined farm life. At the crack of dawn, few fair dishes were as simple, or as filling, as cornmeal mush. It wasn't glamorous, but it was the fuel of farm families, hot, hearty, and drizzled with sweet maple syrup. Cornmeal mush had deep roots in rural America, especially in the 1800s. Made from cornmeal simmered slowly until thick, it was a dish born of necessity, cheap, easy, and endlessly adaptable. At state fairs, farmers' wives entered their versions into competitions, often sweetened with locally harvested maple syrup, turning plain mush into something comforting and familiar. For fairgoers, it was the kind of breakfast that stuck to your ribs. Children loved the sticky sweetness of maple syrup, while judges admired its practicality and honest representation of farm life. In a world before processed cereals, mush was the definition of sustenance. What seems humble to us today carried a kind of pride back then. To serve cornmeal mush was to celebrate thrift, simplicity, and the flavors of the land, values that echoed throughout America's early fairs. And as the morning meals gave way to midday spectacles, fairgoers would soon find themselves sampling stranger delights waiting just down the midway. At the state fairs of old, dessert sometimes came with a shocking twist: oyster ice cream. Yes, seafood met sweet in a daring experiment that fascinated some and repulsed others. In the late 1800s, oysters were cheap, plentiful, and considered refined. Cooks at fairs experimented by blending them into rich cream, sugar, and eggs, churning a frozen dish that seemed both luxurious and odd. Fairs were places of novelty. People came to be surprised. Oyster ice cream became a talking point, a dish that pushed boundaries and made tasters feel adventurous, even if they never asked for seconds. While some insisted it was refreshing, many left with wrinkled noses. Over time, it became a cautionary tale of culinary excess, proof that not every experiment should survive. But oysters weren't the only fair food that tested limits. Another dish offered a challenge far closer to home: fried calf brains, a delicacy once praised for nourishment. At early state fairs, one dish shocked outsiders but was prized by locals: fried calf brains. Considered a delicacy, they were served golden and crisp, celebrated for nutrition at a time when nothing from the animal was wasted. In rural America, thrift guided cooking. Brains were battered, fried in lard, and presented as proof of resourceful farm life. Judges often praised these dishes as examples of using every part of the animal wisely. Fairs weren't only about fun, they displayed survival skills. Fried calf brains symbolized frugality and nourishment, offering protein to families who could not afford choice cuts. Many fairgoers believed they strengthened the body and sharpened the mind. While praised in their day, modern crowds recoil at the thought. The sizzling platters that once impressed judges now serve as reminders of just how daring and practical farm cooking once had to be. But not all oddities were born of thrift. Some, like vinegar pie, revealed the creativity of turning scarcity into sweetness, dazzling judges with flavor when luxury ingredients were absent. When lemons were scarce, fair cooks turned to vinegar. Homemade vinegar pie, with its tart bite and custard-like texture, became a thrifty yet ingenious dessert that surprised judges with just how sweet, sour could taste. Popular in the 19th century, vinegar pie was a creation of necessity. Rural families used pantry staples, eggs, sugar, and vinegar, to mimic lemon custard. At state fairs, it showcased ingenuity in making luxury flavors from humble means. Fairs celebrated resourcefulness, and vinegar pie proved that even poor households could craft impressive dishes. Judges admired its flavor and symbolism, a triumph of simplicity and creativity over scarcity, turning hardship into a prize-worthy dessert. To modern tastes, vinegar pie sounds unappealing, but for early Americans, it was a clever way to enjoy brightness when exotic fruits were out of reach. Today, its story feels both strange and inspiring. And while vinegar pie won hearts through thrift, another fair favorite, boiled custard with nutmeg, thrilled with comfort and tradition, filling tables with rich, creamy warmth. Boiled custard wasn't just dessert, it was tradition. At early state fairs, this creamy, silky smooth dish dusted with fragrant nutmeg became a favorite among judges and families alike. Custard recipes were carried to America from Europe, but state fairs gave them a new stage. Boiled custard was often made with milk, eggs, sugar, and nutmeg, ingredients many farming families already had on hand. It became a symbol of turning simple supplies into comfort and luxury. Unlike vinegar pie or pickled treats, boiled custard felt familiar and indulgent. Judges loved its smooth texture and balanced sweetness, while families cherished it as a dish that brought everyone together around the table. What surprises us today is how central nutmeg was. This exotic spice, once a costly import, transformed humble boiled milk and eggs into a dish worthy of state fair prizes. That sprinkle of spice was more than garnish, it was status. As vinegar pies and custards cooled on the judges' tables, another hearty dish was being ladled out, one that carried the name of luxury but was built on thrift: mock turtle soup. Imagine a steaming bowl of soup at the fair, not made from turtle, but from calf heads. Mock turtle soup became a curious blend of thrift and luxury, a dish that fascinated fairgoers and puzzled modern palates. In the 1800s, real turtle meat was expensive and hard to find, yet the English-inspired soup was fashionable. American cooks improvised by using calf heads, feet, and organs, simmering them into a rich broth that mimicked the prized dish. At state fairs, this ingenuity was celebrated as resourceful cookery. Mock turtle soup was a statement of both refinement and thrift. Families could claim the elegance of European cuisine without paying for exotic ingredients, and judges admired the skill it took to transform humble cuts into something flavorful and dignified. What shocks us today is the ingredient list. Using calf brains, tongues, and heads was common in early cookery, but for modern diners, the thought alone feels unsettling. For fairgoers of the time, though, it was ingenuity at its finest. From the hearty bowls of mock turtle soup, sweet aromas drifted from the baking tents, rich, sticky slices of sorghum molasses cake that reminded fairgoers of home. The sweet, sticky smell of molasses drifting through the fairground was enough to draw a crowd. Sorghum molasses cake wasn't just dessert, it was a symbol of farm tradition and homemade pride. In the 19th century, sorghum was a farmer's answer to sugar. Grown across the Midwest and South, its syrup was cheaper and easier to produce. At state fairs, families baked sorghum cakes to showcase their skill, often spiced with cinnamon or ginger to add warmth. The cake was hearty, sweet, and deeply nostalgic. To rural families, it tasted like home, while to city visitors, it was a chance to savor something authentically farm-made. Judges admired the texture and balance of flavors, often awarding ribbons to the best bakers. But to many outsiders, the flavor was overpowering, thick, bittersweet, and sticky on the tongue. Some city folk whispered that it was too heavy for polite company, while farmers proudly defended it as a true taste of the land. From the sticky sweetness of sorghum, the fairgrounds soon returned to something saltier: pressed head cheese, a dish as puzzling as it was proudly displayed. It wasn't cheese at all, but a shimmering loaf of meat jelly. Pressed head cheese was one of the most unusual and proudly displayed entries at America's earliest state fairs. Made by boiling pig heads until the meat fell from the bone, then pressing it with spices into a loaf, head cheese was born of thrift. Nothing was wasted on the farm, and fairs became the perfect stage to celebrate this resourceful dish. For farm families, pressed head cheese represented skill, thrift, and tradition. Judges admired its clarity, firmness, and seasoning. To win with head cheese was proof of both resourcefulness and culinary pride. Yet for outsiders, the sight could be unsettling: chunks of meat suspended in glistening jelly. Some whispered in disgust, while others marveled at the boldness of farm families who turned scraps into celebration. From the heavy richness of head cheese, the fairgrounds offered something more rugged: wild game jerky, where hunters brought the taste of the forest straight to the judges' tables. At America's first state fairs, jerky wasn't just beef, it was deer, rabbit, even raccoon. Wild game jerky became both a snack and a symbol of frontier survival. In rural America, jerky had roots in hunting culture. Families dried venison or rabbit over smoky fires, preserving it for winter. State fairs gave them a place to showcase this skill to crowds. Jerky symbolized practicality and resourcefulness. It was lightweight, long-lasting, and deeply tied to the frontier spirit. Judges praised its flavor, texture, and the craft of making meat survive long journeys. But to city visitors, the idea of eating raccoon or rabbit jerky felt strange, sometimes even scandalous. What was normal for farm life seemed exotic, even unsettling, under the fair tents. From the smoky toughness of wild meats, fairgoers could wander to something gentler: salads like cabbage and apple slaw, where freshness from the fields met the sweetness of orchards. Amidst meats and heavy pies, cabbage and apple slaw stood out, a crisp, sweet and sour dish that brought the farm's freshness to the fair table. In the 19th century, cabbage was a farm staple, stored in root cellars for months. Apples were plentiful in orchards. Together, they became a thrifty dish proudly displayed at fairs. The slaw wasn't just tasty, it was refreshing. At fairs dominated by salted meats and rich pies, its crunch and tartness were a welcome change, earning smiles from judges and visitors alike. Yet some urban visitors found it too simple: just chopped cabbage and fruit? To rural families, though, it was pride, proof that humble farm produce could shine as brightly as any fancy dish. And for those seeking warmth instead of crunch, the scent of cider donuts fried fresh nearby promised a taste of fall in every bite. At the fairgrounds, nothing tempted crowds quite like the warm, spiced aroma of cider donuts, golden rings that carried the flavor of autumn in every bite. Apples were abundant, and cider was a staple drink. Farmers discovered that adding cider to donut batter gave the treat a tangy sweetness that felt both rustic and celebratory. These donuts were portable, cheap, and perfect for sharing. They became the unofficial snack of the fair, bought by the dozen and eaten hot, sugar dust coating the fingers of happy fairgoers. For many, a simple donut carried deep meaning. It tasted like harvest time, like home. And for farm families, it was proof that their apples could create joy beyond just cider. Yet while cider donuts celebrated apples in a sweet way, nearby tables offered a tangier taste: pickled green tomatoes, crunchy and sharp, served straight from the jar. Crunchy, tangy, and a little unexpected, pickled green tomatoes became a fair staple, offering crowds a sharp bite that contrasted perfectly with the sugary sweets surrounding them. When tomatoes hadn't ripened, thrifty farmers pickled them. At fairs, these jars showed creativity in preserving harvests. They became both a practical food and a curiosity for urban visitors unfamiliar with the tart flavor. Cheap, refreshing, and easy to pack, they were offered in jars or as slices. Pickled green tomatoes gave fairgoers a break from heavy foods, proving that even leftovers could shine when transformed. To modern palates, a sour green tomato may sound odd. But to many fairgoers, it was a nostalgic taste of summer's end, a reminder that nothing from the farm went to waste. From tangy tomatoes to rich mince pies with suet, state fairs celebrated every flavor, whether sharp, hearty, or sweetly indulgent. Heavy, rich, and deeply spiced, mince pies with suet were a fair classic, warming the body and showcasing the heartiness of rural kitchens. Made with dried fruits, spices, and beef suet, these pies reflected old-world traditions. At fairs, they were judged on flaky crusts and perfectly balanced filling, connecting American fairs to European culinary roots. Suet pies symbolized thrift and tradition. Farmers used every part of an animal, and fairs highlighted this resourcefulness. Judges admired their richness, while visitors found comfort in their dense, winter-ready flavor. To modern eaters, adding beef fat to sweet pies sounds strange. But for early Americans, it gave depth and longevity, making mince pies both practical and luxurious. And from rich pies to delicate sweetness, maple sugar candy offered a lighter, playful taste of the fair. At the state fairs of the 1800s, tables often sparkled with little molded maple sugar candies. They weren't just treats, they were souvenirs of farm pride. Maple sugaring was a serious business across New England and parts of the Midwest. Families tapped trees, boiled sap in iron kettles, and poured the thickened syrup into carved wooden molds. At the fair, these candies were shaped into leaves, animals, or even tiny people, each piece a sugary work of art. They mattered because they were more than sweets. Maple sugar was a symbol of self-reliance. No imports, no fancy equipment, just what the land provided. Buying or tasting a piece at the fair connected people to the farms that produced them. The twist. Many fairgoers found them almost too sweet. Without modern refining, the maple sugar had an intense, earthy flavor that overwhelmed some palates. Still, they sold by the handful, tucked into pockets as edible mementos. Next, the fairs turned from sweetness to something far more rustic, scrapple. If there was ever a dish that divided fairgoers, it was scrapple, a recipe that turned farm leftovers into something both beloved and bewildering. Scrapple came from the Pennsylvania Dutch, who refused to waste a single part of the hog. They boiled down scraps, heads, hearts, and trimmings, mixed them with cornmeal, and pressed the mixture into loaves. At the first state fairs, scrapple was more than food, it was proof of thrift and ingenuity, a reminder that nothing from the farm went unused. For working families, scrapple was hearty and cheap. Fried in a pan until crispy on the outside and soft within, it was filling enough to fuel a day of hard labor or long walks through bustling fairgrounds. Many saw it as a symbol of self-reliance and old-world tradition carried into the new world. But for outsiders, the idea of eating hog scraps pressed into a loaf was unsettling. Some couldn't stomach it, while others swore by its flavor and texture. Scrapple drew lines. Was it humble genius, or just too much thrift on a plate? From pork scraps molded into loaves, the fairground spotlight shifted next to something more refined, a dish that dressed up the ox tongue with mustard sauce, proving that thrift could also look elegant. At the old state fairs, some dishes were meant to shock as much as satisfy. And few drew more whispers than a centerpiece of boiled ox tongue, sliced neatly and served with a sharp mustard sauce. In the 1800s, oxen were the backbone of farm life, pulling plows, hauling wagons, and working the fields. When they were finally butchered, not a scrap was wasted. The tongue, though unusual to us today, was considered both thrifty and elegant. Served boiled and paired with mustard, it became a display of farm resourcefulness and culinary pride. For many fairgoers, the dish represented a strange blend of luxury and necessity. Judges admired its preparation, noting how tender the meat could be when cooked properly. Families, meanwhile, saw it as a way of honoring the whole animal. To modern eyes, the thought of ox tongue might wrinkle a nose. But in those days, it was a proud display, one that bridged the gap between hard farm life and the refined tastes of the fairground table. Some dishes at the early state fairs were born from pure creativity, and none surprised visitors more than the baked bean pie. A twist on the New England staple, this dish blended savory beans with sweet pie crust. In the 19th century, baked beans were a cornerstone of working-class meals. Slow cooked with molasses, they filled bellies and stretched scarce resources. But clever home cooks began experimenting. Why not turn those beans into a pie? At fairs, these golden-crusted creations were proudly entered into baking competitions, where judges admired the thrift and ingenuity behind them. Fairgoers often approached with hesitation. A pie should be sweet, shouldn't it? Yet the first bite revealed a surprising balance: earthy beans, molasses sweetness, and flaky crust. It was humble food made extraordinary, a reminder that frugality could also be delicious. Today, the idea of bean pie might sound odd, but at America's first fairs, it showed how ordinary farm staples could be transformed into something worthy of blue ribbons. Few things captured the spirit of early fairs like the fizzy glass of homemade root beer. Long before soda fountains, families proudly brewed their own, each recipe a guarded secret of herbs, spices, and roots. In the 19th century, root beer wasn't just a sweet treat, it was medicine, refreshment, and entertainment all in one. Sassafras, sarsaparilla, molasses, and even ginger found their way into the bubbling brew. State fairs offered the perfect stage, where farmers and homemakers brought jugs of their best batches to be judged not only for taste, but for how lively the fizz would dance in a glass. Children marveled at the crackle and foam, while adults debated whose recipe had the strongest kick. To win a ribbon meant prestige, proof that your family's recipe stood above the rest. Though modern sodas would later dominate, those first mugs of homemade root beer embodied a simple joy: community, craftsmanship, and the magic of bubbles rising on a summer fair day. Few fair foods caught the eye quite like a jar of pickled eggs glowing pink in beet juice. For many farm families, it was a way to preserve surplus eggs, but at the fair, it became a curiosity that drew curious stares. In the late 1800s, glass jars of these ruby-colored eggs often sat on exhibit tables, their jewel-like color standing out among pies and cakes. The recipe was simple: hard-boiled eggs soaked in vinegar, sugar, and beet brine, but the result looked striking, even otherworldly. Fairgoers were torn. Some delighted in the tangy sweet bite, while others couldn't get past the shocking color. Judges, however, respected the skill of preservation and the creativity behind turning something ordinary into a dazzling display piece. While today they may seem odd, those jars of bright pink eggs symbolized the ingenuity of homemakers, who could take a humble chicken's egg and transform it into a conversation piece of the fairgrounds. No state fair food brought more smiles than the fried apple hand pie. Golden, flaky, and filled with spiced apples, these portable treats were both a dessert and a memory wrapped in paper. In the mid to late 1800s, apple hand pies became a fairground staple. Apples were plentiful on American farms, and frying gave them a rich, irresistible flavor. Unlike whole pies that needed slicing, these hand-sized versions could be eaten on the go, making them perfect for bustling fairgrounds. Families often fried them in cast-iron pans, dusting them with sugar before entering them into contests. Judges admired their balance of crust, filling, and seasoning. For fairgoers, they were the kind of treat that warmed the hands and comforted the spirit. Though simple, fried apple hand pies carry the taste of tradition, farm thrift, and sweetness all in one bite. To many, they remain the most beloved symbol of fairground comfort food. State fairs were more than competitions. They were showcases of resourcefulness, creativity, and pride. From pickled watermelon rinds to fried apple hand pies, these recipes weren't just food, they were memories of an America that worked hard, shared deeply, and celebrated simply. Each dish carried a story of thrift, of ingenuity, of families bringing their best to the table. Some recipes may seem strange to us now, squirrel stew or oyster ice cream, but they reflected a time when nothing was wasted, and everything had meaning. And then there were the timeless comforts, like cider donuts or apple hand pies, whose flavors still echo across generations. Together, These recipes paint a picture of America's first fairs as more than just events. They were the heartbeat of small towns, the taste of home, and the spirit of community. If you enjoyed this trip back in time, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more journeys into the America we remember. Until next time, may the flavors of history stay with you.